talk about splaining, shall we? Now, I know the term that's often used is generally mansplaining, but let's be inclusive here, shall we? Because other folks do it too, maybe not as often. Splaining, mansplaining, whatever you want to call it, it's the sanctimonious giving of advice or guidance or information or detail by someone when it is unnecessary, patronizing, excessive, and often wrong, and it is typically unwanted. Again, to keep it neutral in this video, I'm going to call it splaining. My favorite recently was somebody giving me insistent, judgy, preachy financial advice, but the fool had $20 in his bank account. Thanks, but no. Splaining is, it's your uncle who hasn't worked in a particular industry for 25 years giving you professional advice, or worse yet, criticism, when you are working in a business that has changed radically since your uncle worked in it, and it can be really irritating splaining if that uncle wasn't particularly good at the job. Splaining is the person who has never lived in a particular region where you just moved. Maybe they went on vacation there once, telling you the best ways to get around the place. Splaining is someone who knows literally nothing about what you do. For example, they're an accountant and you're a preschool teacher, but they're telling you the best way to do your job. Splaining is the person who doesn't have kids, giving you all kinds of advice and big explanations about child rearing. And in all cases, when a person splains, they are not listening to a word you are saying. It's a one-sided conversation. Splaining breaks any reciprocity in a conversation. In a healthy conversation, one person says something, for example, "Hey, how are you? You know, I'm really enjoying my new job, but oof, the hours are rough." And the other person says, "Ugh, I'm sorry about the hours, but I'm glad you enjoy it. It sounds interesting. Tell me about the job. Tell me what you're hoping for in this job." In a reciprocal conversation, the other person is listening. They're curious. That new job person responds. They have a back and forth. And that conversation is a place where both people feel heard. And then the other person will share. Maybe the new job person says, hey, how's stuff going in your job? Splaining, though, in this conversation would be if you say, "I'm really enjoying my new job, but the hours are long." And then the other person, the splainer, says, "Yeah, you know, in those kinds of positions, you need to be sure that you keep that record of your hours. I'm sure you're using that particular record system. And you might want to also look into the XYZ software. Your employer is using that, right? Because if they're not using that software, they are behind that time. But they're behind the times. That software, that'll let you track your hours and your contributions and the sales you closed. Make sure they have that XYZ software, because if they don't, blah, 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 blah. You know what I'm talking about, right? They're not listening to you. They just wanted to do their blah, blah. Splaining can also occur when you are asking for an answer, but instead you get an explanation. You may go up to them and say, "Hey, you're running out. Hey, could you pick up some bananas and some bread when you're out?" But then you get a dissertation on the dangers of white bread and the proper places to buy bread, the hours of said proper place to buy bread, and how you make the mistake of always getting the multigrain bread from the ABC XYZ store, but it's not really multigrain, and what you buy is as bad as white bread. And you're thinking, "Oh my God, just get the damned bread." The most challenging splaining happens when it involves a topic you actually know a lot about. It could be something that you do for a living. It could be a skill that you've honed. It was interesting. I was recently at a dinner thing some time ago. Not that recently, but I was at a dinner. And there was a guy there who was working, I don't know, on some podcast or something like that. And they always chased the trends, and they were doing a lot of shows on narcissism. This dude had zero background in it. He was not a mental health professional, but he had been immersed in the topic. Everyone at the table knew what I did for a living, and he was holding the table entranced with his splaining. And he turned to me and he said, "Did you have any idea that?" And he just shared some random fact about narcissism that clearly I knew. And then he kept going. I just smiled politely and made a mental note that splaining needs to be a video. Thanks for the idea, bruh. So in his case, this guy was narcissistic, and he needed the attention. And the interesting thing about his splaining is his stance, that it was as though he was the first, or at least the wisest person, whoever knew these things. I ended up excusing myself to go to the dessert table, as I do. I ate a lot that night just to get away from it all, because it was the only polite thing I could do. Is like, I'm just going to get more dessert. So what does this have to do with narcissism? It has a lot to do with narcissism. Splaining is very much a feature of the narcissistic personality, but they're not the only ones who do it. Lots of folks may splain. It may be certainly kind of a culturally allowable communication. It may be a feature of social anxiety. And in some cases, when the splainer is not narcissistic, they may actually be able to tolerate being told gently that they're being a little bit extra, and then they may stop without raging at you. None of that's going to work with a narcissistic person. So you might wonder, why do folks with narcissistic personalities splain? Well, because of the entitlement, the arrogance, the lack of regard for others, the attention and validation needs, the lack of self-awareness, the incapacity for reciprocal and mutual relationships. And if that is coupled with cultural stuff, for example, around gender or resources or something like that, forget it. The person will never shut up. It is paradoxical how well narcissistic people can simultaneously be able to read and not read a room. Remember, too, there is a touch of social anxiety to narcissistic people. They're afraid of being judged, right? Especially vulnerable narcissistic folks. It's, I need to be right. I need to be heard. And it gets ugly because the vulnerable narcissistic person also thinks everyone around them is stupid, or at least dumber than them. So the splaining kind of follows naturally. And because the vulnerable narcissistic person often doesn't have the same sort of zhuzh in terms of charm and charisma and that socially skilled top coat that the grandiose narcissistic person has, the vulnerable narcissistic person just starts talking. Narcissistic splaining can really kick in when they feel it all insecure or a little bit sort of psychologically threatened, and that's often when it shows up. For example, someone in a group or in a conversation is sharing something that brings up an insecurity or a shame or a less than in the narcissistic person, or that other person talking is simply more successful, more senior, doing well. And as a result, the narcissistic person may start doing some splaining to even the so-called playing field. It is also not unusual that when they are doing their splaining, that their speech is very pressured. And pressured speech is when the person talking is talking at a speed or at a rate or an intensity that it is almost impossible for anyone else to get a word in edgewise. So everyone who's polite just sits there, relatively bored, and listens and listens and listens and checks out or goes to the dessert table. The vulnerable narcissistic splaining can also have what we call a pedantic vibe to it. Pedantic means that it's teachy and preachy and nitpicky. So you may say, oh, I stayed at the XYZ hotel in Los Angeles. And the pedantic splainer will say, actually, no, you didn't. That particular hotel is actually in a place called Pasadena. And it's not called the XYZ hotel anymore. Now it's the ABC hotel. And really, the quality has dropped since that new company took it over. The whole thing is awkward and self-righteous and icky. In addition, the vulnerable narcissistic splaining can be dismissive. Sometimes it has sort of a tone of mockery, a sense that you don't know anything about that, or that people like you couldn't know. And so everyone needs to step back and let the splainer splain. In grandiose narcissistic folks, the splaining can look like them holding court. They wah, and people listen to their stories. But it isn't always splaining per se. It's often just storytelling. Splaining is typically actually an explanation of how something works, or what they consider to be the right answer to something according to them, or that's just the way they do things. Self-righteous narcissistic folks can do a lot of moralistic splaining, like, we don't do it that way, or this is the right way to do that. and then go on about explaining their virtuous diets or how they only eat organic vegetables fertilized by their goat's manure, or their lifestyles or disciplinary styles, or back in my day kind of BS. But it is the vulnerable narcissistic folks who most often fall back on the splaining, because it is both a defensive, self-protective, and attacking tactic for them. Ultimately, all this splaining is exhausting, it is one-sided, and it is depleting for anyone on the receiving side of a splain. I recently had 2 conversations back to back in a day. It was really interesting to me. One with an absolutely delightful person, where there was lots of back and forth. I really wanted to hear what they say. They wanted to hear what I said. We were learning from each other. And frankly, I really didn't want the conversation to end. We both knew stuff. We both had respect for the other. And it was great. A little while later, I had the splainy conversation. And ironically, it was about a very similar subject as I had had the good conversation earlier that day. In the splainy conversation, I found myself shut down, disinterested, wishing I could play solitaire on my phone while they talked and talked and talked. I tried to do some meditating and breathing exercises as their meh went on that I could not interrupt, all that pressured speech. I did a few more breathing exercises. And then I made a few comments about the weather and was relieved when the whole splainy mess was over. I felt uplifted after the healthy conversation. I felt tired and aggravated after the splainy one. When you know, you know. The splainer in this case, in my case that I was talking about, is sort of a mild, vulnerable narcissist. They're sometimes nice. But in this particular person, when their insecurity gets triggered, we're off to the splainy races. I got smart though, and I put solitaire on my iPad. So at least I can keep myself busy while they yammer on when they're on the phone with me. That doesn't work in person. At those times, I have to use the breathing exercises and grounding exercises, but when they can't see me, whew, the solitaire saves the day. And no, this pattern is not something you can communicate about or address with narcissistic splainers. If you actually went up to a narcissistic person and said, "Stop splaining," they're going to lose it. "How dare you?" Or "No, I'm not." Or like, "Ugh, you're so jealous, you don't know anything." Or "You're rude." Or they would accuse you of being the one who's narcissistic or insecure. So at the end of it, when you try to stop this splaining, you're insulted and the splaining still continues. Radical acceptance, baby. They ain't going to stop splaining. So you got to learn the polite Mona Lisa smile and head nod with a few, oh, I see. And make sure you have some healthy folks in your life who aren't splainers, because you're going to need them as a sanity offset. So sometimes with narcissism or difficult, toxic personalities, it's not the meanness and the manipulation and the gaslighting that gets to you in these relationships. It's the boredom. Because if you don't try to get in a word edgewise, being in a narcissistic relationship is like being locked in a room and being forced to listen to a really boring podcast about an uninteresting topic with a host that has nothing to say. Thanks again.